This is the In Focus podcast from The Hindu.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the In Focus podcast. I'm your host, G. Sampath. This year's edition of the United Nations Climate Summit, COP-28, concluded in Dubai earlier this week. It began with a lot of expectations, especially on the key issue of phasing out fossil fuels. In the end, a deal seems to have been worked out to transition away from fossil fuels. So what exactly does the Dubai consensus, as this agreement has been called, what does it exactly entail? What are the other major takeaways from this summit? And what progress, if any, has been made on a key issue of climate justice? Given the extremely slow and famously limited progress in COP meetings that we've had so far, where decisions are based on consensus, what are the alternative modes of collective decision making that we could be looking at as well? We discuss all these questions and more in this issue of In Focus, and we have with us Kanchi, who's a researcher in environment, law and governance and co-author of the book Development of Environmental Laws in India. Kanchi, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Always a pleasure to be on this podcast.
Great. So to start with, I was just wondering, Kanchi, so COP28 has concluded with this deal, which has been hailed by some people as historic. But there are also critics who are saying that not enough has been done. There are a lot of loopholes. So basically, it seems to talk about transitioning away from fossil fuels rather than phasing out fossil fuels. So is this really a significant step forward? Because people say fossil fuels were never mentioned in any deals or agreements before. And what kind of commitments, if any, does this agreement, the Dubai consensus, entail?
Yeah, I mean, so I definitely think it's a very important moment for us to really stock take on how the COPs themselves have progressed and how the discourse itself has progressed. And if you see the outcome of the primary, the big chunk of how the energy transition has been envisaged as part of the global stock take and other kinds of conversations, it's very significant that what we see in front of us is almost like it's almost like the global stock trade commits to everything. So there is something for everybody to deal with, but the prioritization is what we need to really get deeper into. For instance, it really brings together some of the biggest conundrums around the use of energy, what nature of energy, all those kinds of things, very much as part of the outcomes. For instance, it talks about phasing down of unabated coal. It talks about transitioning away from fossil fuels. It talks about increasing renewable energy capacity. It also endorses the use of transitional fuels like natural gas. Now, this gives the impression that or the understanding that the people in the room were okay with countries deciding the energy mix that they want to use, provided the ultimate goal of net zero is met. So, the pool of risk, so nothing was blacklisted in the sense. The gain, of course, which countries like India has been pushing for, and it's on the table now, is that it puts coal at par with other fossil fuels. So there are definitely some gains that have been made, but it very clearly, brings out that nothing is going to be off the table. There is going to be investment in all kinds of energy technologies, all forms of energy generation projects, and it will also then throw up very significant challenges to domestic governments on how they will want to regulate it. In some ways, this also reflects the pool of people who have driven this COP. It's basically and which in some ways the geopolitical situations worldwide has made sure that some of this is acceptable to the conversations. For instance, corporations, governments who will be able to take forward coal, gas, renewable energy, or critical minerals projects are really dominating the conversation. Investors who can invest in these industries and infrastructure projects have dominated these conversations. So I think it is historic. It's significant because it marks a shift from shift from the push that was there, that the focus on certain forms of fuel, the focus on that there is an urgency and that's why certain action needs to be taken. It's seeming like all of it is going to be in the mix for countries to be able to decide how they want to go forward, and that becomes a big, huge economic development question.
Right. I was just curious about the kind of language we find in this. You're talking about phasing out and phasing, not even phasing out, transitioning and accelerating, and unabated versus these kinds of incremental kind of responses. Are they really serious? Do they constitute a serious response to a threat which is really serious? One can imagine why someone like Greta Thunberg would want to boycott it. She's not the only one who's boycotted it. But to what extent do we look at these kinds of? It's not even a commitment. It's more, like you said, every country and every party, so to speak, of this has been given a lot of leeway to come up with their own mix. And there, don't you think there isn't enough of what should I say? Leeway again for those who don't have the kind of privileges and which, let us say, the industrialized countries may have. If you talk about a concept like carbon space, for example, amount of carbon which can be there in the atmosphere without, increasing climate change crisis, so to speak. That's not really available for everybody in an equal sense. It's already been used up by one particular section, the developed countries already. So in this kind of a scenario, when you're going to be talking incrementally, doesn't that necessarily mean that some parties are going to suffer more and some parties are going to suffer less?
No, absolutely. In fact, that is why if one has to shift the gaze and see this entire discourse not from the energy and energy technology or the carbon emissions point of view, but also try and see it from the point of view of how climate justice issues need to be understood, or use a human rights framing to understand what is happening with the climate discourse, or actually go back to the original discussions around some version of sustainable development, within which climate change was one of the conventions that needed to address the big sustainable development conundrums. I think it's important to also bring back some of those framings and lenses in the mainstream discussions around climate change. Unless and until that has happened, because some of those are there at COPs, but they're peripheral. And they're not front and center. At front and center, it's about business, it's about projects, it's about policies that are talking about energy shifts, all of which is important, but you cannot do that in isolation from the other more fundamental or equally fundamental concerns that are considered to be something that you will deal with when you roll out energy generation projects.
You said that the projects and businesses and so on, renewables, etc., for example, and carbon markets, for instance, these are all center stage. What about livelihoods? Aren't livelihoods a part of the mainstream discourse?
No, so it is. But if you see, like, for instance, the critiques that are coming out, or the analysis that is coming out, not just from this COP, but even earlier, is to say that the points about how the climate crisis, also the focus on adaptation, or the focus on loss and damage, the focus on how new climate technologies will also address, hit livelihoods, like say critical minerals or other kinds of things. If all that happens, how much of that is being is really front and center of the stock take. That's very crucial to have at the front and center of the stock take. Otherwise, it seems like a very sanitized, text which says, okay, we know climate change is a problem. We know we have to keep to the 1.5 degrees warming target, but all the actions are in the form of saving businesses rather than saving the world.
Right. I mean, there is clearly a disjunction here. Now, moving away from the text of the UAE or the Dubai consensus, what are the other takeaways, big takeaways from your understanding, your perspective, especially on questions of climate finance, loss and damage fund? I mean, on the first day, there was a big headline about the launch of the loss and damage fund, which I thought was already done and dusted, so to speak, except for the money in the COP-27 last year. And also the energy transitions of poorer countries. What are the takeaways on these three big ticket issues?
Yeah, I think that there are lots of discussions that did take place at the COP from what one could track, and if one breaks it down to the four in some senses four pillars of discussions. One is, of course, around the establishment of the loss and damage fund, which is it's extremely significant. It's important that this issue is acknowledged. There has also been money that has been committed to it, but you can see coalitions and alliances around loss and damage that have this happened on the first day, and then during the rest of the time, a lot of push was made and discussion was on the fact that it's not enough. Because a large part of or a significant part of this fund is going to be around creating the funding arrangements and not really the fund that is available for addressing loss and damage. So a lot more money needs to be put on the table. Yet it's something that it's a huge acknowledgement. So one can't take that away from the COP itself. There are discussions about whether the loss and damage fund should be handled by institutions like the World Bank. Where there have been historical problems that communities have had. So these debates have really come up, but the loss and damage as an issue, as a climate justice issue, as a human rights issue, actually definitely was part of the narrative, and it is definitely an important development. The global stocktake in itself was important because it didn't take away from the fact that we are dealing with there is a climate urgency. It didn't take away from the fact that we are really running late when it comes to addressing some of the concerns. So it definitely was an important outcome. Of course, it was what really came out later was that several countries that had a different perspective were not in the room when the final stocktake was announced. So all those kinds of things are very much part of the COP the COP drama that took place and which probably comes up year after year. On climate finance, I think there's been a lot of and I think a lot more literature and analysis is going to emerge, because climate finance became a huge vexed topic. And in some senses, that is where countries were saying that let us move the way we want to towards net zero, because developed countries were not putting down climate finance to compensate countries for missing out on certain kind of development trajectories or energy choices, and without that, nobody's going to step back from the development aspirations that they have set for themselves. So that became an issue. As I said, there was analysis that a lot less is there for climate adaptation funds, which is extremely important. Although the global stocktake says that you need to make adaptation plans, all those kinds of things, but where is the money to do it? And I think those will become important negotiating points going ahead. The other thing that did not was a bit of a flux and did not go through was the issue of voluntary carbon markets. In fact, its analysis that has come out basically talks about how the EU had basically raised a lot of integrity issues on voluntary carbon markets. In fact, the proposed carbon trading rules were not adopted as part of this whole thing. So it has a huge bearing on the way carbon offsets will be framed in nationally determined commitments of countries, because a lot of countries were hinging a lot on offsets and carbon markets to offset the emission loss that they're not able to deal with emissions reduction. So it's going to all play out in the next few months and a couple of years. It will be very interesting to follow it closely in terms of what are the new challenges that the COP has thrown up.
Right. I mean, speaking of the loss and damage fund, you mentioned that the World Bank is the one which is going to administer it. Wouldn't that then again mean that the biggest donors to the World Bank, which is the US and other OECD countries, they would be in control of that fund rather than the receiving countries, the ones who are going to need that fund?
Yes, I think it's one about how much the global north would control the fund. That is one, and I think a lot of will depending on what the kind of funding arrangement will look like, eventually. But definitely, there is that concern. The other concern that researchers have already started raising is that will this be in the form of debt funds and not grants? And I think that is an important thing to look at, because if this comes to countries, as loans instead of compensations or grants, then that will become a much more difficult thing for countries that are already suffering the losses and are already suffering the consequences and with not having that historical role that they've played in causing the problem as much. It's going to become a bigger challenge because they're not going to be able to deal with it very much. I think some African countries have already started saying that we will be able to contribute to net zero only if you write off our existing debts, and if they can't get into further debt traps through this thing. So this thing is already being spoken about. The fact is, how much of it that is taken on board when we are envisaging what is the way forward to address the climate crisis.
Right. I mean, the climate crisis is also, in a sense, an economic crisis, clearly. Now, you earlier spoke about, you made a reference to climate justice, Kanchi, and I was reading some of the reports, and I think Nelson Mandela's granddaughter was one of the delegates, and she spoke of climate apartheid, how it completely fits the original template of, racial apartheid in South Africa. Can you talk a little bit about how this concept, how it came about? Like, what does it really mean, climate apartheid? Because it's a very powerful origin, the entire concept of apartheid, and how does it fit into this climate justice discourse?
Very broadly, if I would understand it, and I'm sure there are different, there's a lot out there that really deals with this concept, but very broadly, climate apartheid can be understood as a systemic or institutional order through which, existence or furtherance of disproportionate vulnerabilities are allowed to continue, or new ones are, given rise to. So, for instance, it applies to how the history of how this crisis really came into being, as well as how the future climate policies are designed to create more vulnerabilities or displace populations that are already vulnerable. So, in some senses, it's the elite who can use their money to buy, technology to deal with heat or pollution, etc., or move away. Whereas, you have policies that are further going to make certain populations vulnerable to, say, sea erosion, or for that matter, exposure to heat, or living with pollution, etc. So, in some senses, it's a very powerful, framing, as you said, to be able to put front and center that no matter what kind of investment and economic and developmental paradigm that you might draw into the climate discourse, if it is going to be discriminatory in nature, against those who've had the least least contribution to the crisis. And if you add issues of race, gender, and other intersectional issues to it, it brings out it's in some senses is globalizing the question of environmental injustices, which were front and center of some of the oldest environmental movements. So if you apply that lens onto a lot of what is being proposed out of the COPs, or how countries are even framing their nationally determined contributions, it would be important to see for instance, in order to continue a certain level of emissions, to manage your net zero bookkeeping. Where are the offsets really lying? Do you really need to create new kinds of harms? Or for renewable energy and expansion, where are those geographies? What kind of marginal lands are being used, which are more common property resources, etc.? So I think all of it together, in many ways, really feeds into the idea of climate apartheid, and I think it's a powerful way of reviewing the outcomes of the processes.
Right. I mean, I think that's a pretty detailed unpacking of what climate apartheid means. I appreciate that. Thank you, Kanchi, for that. And I was also thinking, you spoke about, the structural or systemic issues, and there are structural and systemic reproductions of privilege, which tend to happen if your solution processes are completely or predominantly market driven, because the opportunities are not equal in a market framework. And there have been people talking about how even within a particular country, we spoke about the historical injustices between the richer countries and the poorer countries, the global north and south. But even within the global north or within the global south, I think how vulnerable you are to impacts of climate change is to a large extent determined by whether you can buy solutions from the market to protect you, with regard to your vulnerability. So in that sense, the rich-poor divide within a particular country also determines, how they're going to be impacted by climate change. And I think this is where the concept of climate apartheid, gains traction. In any case, one final question, Kanchi, before we wind up. We're running out of time. Now we have seen that. I think only in two COPs we have had clear progress in terms of definitive forward momentum, which is at Paris and Kyoto, and Dubai. I don't know. We'll have to wait and see what impact it has. But seeing that we are in COP-28 and only 2 or 3 of these meetings have yielded, substantial momentum forward. I was just wondering, also these meetings have a lot of fossil fuel lobbies and other industrial lobbying groups, who have a powerful say, and they can veto. 1 out of 200 members can veto an agreement, So are there alternative modes of collective decision making that not just in COP but communities elsewhere too, who are concerned about climate action? Can they pursue different modes of engagement that are not at the mercy of a consensus of 200 parties? Because climate change is not going to wait for consensus before it strikes. There is no consensus before a drought or a flood or a famine strikes a country or a community. So there isn't so much time, the luxury of time for every single party in this so-called conference of parties. So can you talk a little bit about other modes of making progress apart from just COP?
See, I think we have to go back to number one. What I've been just thinking, and I would want to put forward as a thought, is that we have to go back to a time where the UNFCCC was one of the conventions under the Rio Summit to address something that was much bigger. The Rio Summit promised us a form of sustainable development along with good regulation, good governance mechanisms, procedural principles like access to justice, public participation, all of which it was almost like it was offering a holistic package. And we've seen how that holistic package has been challenged as countries have progressed to implement it. So in some senses, we have to be able to go back to some of those principles to design how, whether it's climate action on its own or climate-related action with respect to biodiversity or desertification or poverty reduction, all those kinds of larger narratives that were very much part of the discourse back in the 1990s have to be still, you have to bring it back into the question rather than just leaving it to a emission centric conversation. So once you do that, then I think we are able to number one, approach the whole subject in a different way. Now, if you keep that as one point, the other point is the efficacy of the COPs itself. And I think this question is coming up, especially after the last two COPs and where the next COP is going to be held, is that how much can you rely on the COPs as a way forward? The answer to some of the COP veterans has been that COP was never meant to give you all the answers. COP was meant to give broad directions, broad binding targets, iterative sort of voluntary sort of commitments that countries were supposed to be making. So in many ways, what we need is different methodologies of regionally or whether it's geographically or across north-south. I think we need to be able to come to have some of those equitable conversations. And I think people are putting forward some of the methodologies. The question is if there is a commitment to some of these questions and these kinds of lenses to be able to approach the climate crisis. If the climate crisis is seen as one among the many poly crises or the multiple planetary crises that humanity is facing at this point of time, then we'll be able to come up with different methodologies and different kind of people in the room. It would shift the balance, flip the gaze in the way the discussion is extremely emission centric, which requires certain kinds of finance and certain kinds of technology, and that's controlled by large corporations, big governments who are not willing to give up space to be able to control it.
Right. I mean, thank you for that, Kanchi. I think I appreciate you pointing to this this big what should I say, elephant in the room, so to speak, where we are indeed very much focused on emissions, but not in a way that is too helpful when you're going to be sort of invisibilizing the other related poly crisis, as you put it. I mean, you spoke about how the business of carbon has sort of seems to have taken center stage at the expense of, let's say, a climate-related biodiversity, climate-related desertification, climate-related environmental degradation, which, as you rightly pointed out, were at the center stage in the 1990s, but without anyone apparently noticing, they seem to have sort of moved somewhere to the margins. And we've got this entire conversation sort of usurped by the financing of climate-related businesses and projects, which are important, no doubt, because they have the, what should I say, the scale in their favor if we want to move forward in climate mitigation. But nonetheless, I think there is a little bit of what should I say, impoverishment of the discourse around climate action because of this. And I think the next COP, which you refer to, which is going to happen in Azerbaijan, and there are already concerns about, Russia is one of the biggest fossil fuel producing companies. I mean, its economy is dependent on oil and gas, and it's not going to be an easy time for climate activists, etc. And as you said, COP is, of course, just a source of guidelines, and action is not necessarily going to be limited to it, nor should it be. And I think that's where we need to leave off for this episode. Thank you so much once again, Kanchi, for joining us and for sharing your observations and insights. Pleasure talking to you.
Thank you. Thanks for the great set of questions too. Helped me think through things. Thank you.
Thank you.
In Focus will be back soon with analysis of the biggest news issues. In the meantime, you can find our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and other platforms. Just search for In Focus by The Hindu. We'll see you soon.